White's here, okay. My name is Callie White. I attend Sarin. I used to work for the Daily World. I worked for the Grace Harbor Chamber of Commerce. Currently, I'm a stay-at-home mom who serves on the McDermott PTO and the Save Sarin Capital Campaign Group. It's my honor to welcome you to an afternoon of harbor and Hoquiam history. They say many hands make light work. It takes many hands to maintain and support and fix and update a large old building working over many years. Although right now Sarin, the church building, is facing a crisis, it is thanks to many, many people that this church building has been able to survive many serious storms over the years through careful and loving stewardship. And I'm here to tell you about some of those people. I did my research for this during prep for an apple pie fundraiser. Now, the collective memory coming up with these names was definitely making lighter work of the pies. They divided up who was chopping apples, who was rolling the dough, etc. They each had a goal and a specific part to play. But if you've ever been in a kitchen with a dozen lovely Lutheran and Presbyterian women who are all simultaneously tasked with telling you who has worked on their church building, it gets pretty complicated pretty fast. Rudy Anderson climbed into the steeple for the water repair. Knutson and Berg, they made the sound room in the third story, also the cabinets in the parsonage and the preschool cabinets. There was a preschool here in the 70s. There was a family upstairs. They were Latvian. The Urkums, they probably improved the living conditions. You can see where this is going, right? So I found a life raft. Her name is Linda Borth, back there. And that's for chronology of what women could remember, and here is what I have. In the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the Melhoffs, Larsons, the Bergs, the Knutsons, the Friedrichsons, the Druggies were the families that did a lot of the work. There was also Scoutmaster Emil Ekman and John Anderson. Leo Carbone was also the unofficial janitor and handyman who was known to wash dishes by hand after big church meals for years until a dishwasher was installed. In the late 60s, Pastor Joe Smith left the legacy of this gold tiled wall behind me. In the 70s, there were the Ask Boys, Ken and Martin Ask. Ed Bowers was always a big giver, and with friends, arranged for the church offices to be moved from an outside building to a new addition, the Mahler Learning Center, which is where you entered. Seppo Tuominen directed the raising of the frame and the installation of the roof and windows. One time that room was flooded and Seppo with help pulled up and dried all the floorboards, numbering them as he went so they could be put back easily. He also created a removable water dam to protect the building in the future. The Smith, Latins, Rowleys, Tuominens, Borths, and Druggies were the families that started doing more with the church maintenance at that time. The atrium fountain was donated by Mary Paulson and Donna Lee, the owners of the Pond Place, to make the entrance to the new addition attractive. In the 1980s, Harold Erickson stood up in the congregation, told everyone they were getting old, and we got to get an elevator installed. So, with the help of Rudy Anderson, they made it happen. By the way, Rudy's wife was known to answer the phone, "Yes, Rudy's at home. He's at the church." That's just how active he was here. Karen Reese was the church secretary in the 1980s, and she had the Druggy kids come in and paint the interior of the church's annex. Al Brune was instrumental in maintenance until his death last year. He would come in and take care of anything anyone needed at the last minute. There's a picture downstairs of him, Roger Borth, Seppo Tuominen, and Ron Bacon installing a fire escape that they built in 2006. Mark and Carla Johnson have stepped up in the past few years to handle the building. Mark has helped put in a new roof on the Mahler addition, overseen bathroom repairs, fixed lighting, and hot water tank issues. It takes a lot of people doing a lot of things that don't seem terribly remarkable at the time they're doing them to keep a community, an institution, plugging along. The work is very low profile, the accolades few and far between, but the small-scale volunteering in a kitchen, with a hammer and saw, at a preschool, this is how community is built. This is how the backdrop is laid for the bigger historic moments in a church and a community. I'd like to say thank you to the Friends of the Aberdeen Museum and Connie Parsons for bringing in the beautiful displays of the Harbor Historic Churches downstairs. I have to make apologies for John Hughes. If you don't know him, he is the longtime editor and publisher of the Daily World, who now is the state historian. He has published numerous books on towering figures of Washington state history, and just a formidable lover of Hoquiam. Unfortunately, he has reasons he cannot be here today, but when God closes one door, he definitely opens a window, and he opened a giant, enormous stained glass window when he had Tom Quigg come in to present in John's place. Tom Quigg, he used to own Windermere Real Estate, but currently his main job is as a port commissioner. He is a local history enthusiast who has published The Culture of Success online, which is a number of stories of local figures, and he is a very popular speaker. But before he speaks, you'll hear John Larson. John Larson is a member of CERN. He left to get educated and came back to become the director of the Pulse Museum, which he's done for more than 20 years now. And recently, thanks to COVID, he was able to do a nice refresh of the interior of the museum for new exhibits. I encourage all of you who haven't been there to go check it out. It's amazing. Also, if you haven't seen the railroad camp, that's a very impressive installation with an amazing train inside it. So, that said, let's welcome John Larson.
Well, it's great to see a nice crowd here today. I appreciate all of you deciding to come indoors on one of the first really nice days we've had all year. So this is a pleasure of mine to be able to present some history very specifically about the geography, the geographical location that we are all seated in right now. When Callie and Michelle, Pastor Michelle, had asked if I would, I guess essentially be the warm-up act for today's program, I said, I think I could pull together a pretty fun slideshow on the subject because there's just so much history that occurred literally on this site and then fanning out from here a little ways. And so using that as my kind of hook, that's the right word, the hook to figure out what should I present. I thought geography, and then I'd throw a little bit of chronology in there with it. And so though we don't have photos going back to the time before basically settler white folks showed up here and started building stuff on these sites, if you can imagine a big marshy swampland here, I mean that's essentially what Hoquiam was. You had the Hoquiam River coming to the Chehalis, and you had a whole lot of tide flat that was real murky, mucky, whatnot. And one of the first things built, and certainly the first thing built on this site, was the Hotel Hoquiam. And so you're going to have to bear with me as I navigate this fancy control. I did try to practice quite a bit before, but I don't think I still have the hang of it. So you'll see this little pointer floating around here. This is the Hotel Hoquiam. And I'm going to kind of blow past some of these little tiny photos because I didn't realize that they would not replicate well. But Hotel Hoquiam was a marvel of construction. And it's kind of a miracle. So something so big and so lavish got built here in Hoquiam before Hoquiam was really much of a place. This was built 1 year before this town was incorporated. So 1885, the town of Hoquiam was platted. 1889 into 90 was when they were really figuring out city government and what to do in terms of creating a city, an actual city with rules and guidelines and codes and things of that nature. And it was under speculation that the Northern Pacific Railway was going to show up here to Hoquiam, that some promoters got together and said, we should build this thing. And how they settled on this, I don't have any of the history on architect or who did the design work. But remarkably, the Northwest Lumber Company, which was the first sawmill built here in Hoquiam, which was in 1881, so this is just do the math, 9 years before. You can see in the distance here the Hoquiam Hotel, back in the woods there. The Northwest Lumber Company decided that the way to get this built was that they would cover the wages of the folks working here and working to build that. And they put forth the money to make that happen. Make this go. I've got some great photos that have come from a whole lot of different sources. Like the last one was a postcard. This is from the Joe Stearns collection. Joseph Stearns was Josiah Stearns was a well-known, to local people anyway, well-known amateur photographer who could be seen around with his glass plate negative camera taking photos of all sorts of buildings. Hoquiam Hotel, this is not a view you see that often from such a distance, but when I say this was built on marshland, driftwood, literally came right up to the edge of the hotel. The building was 70 rooms in total, and I threw in just a few just because it's such a well-photographed building. 70 rooms. It was built for a whopping sum of $100,000 in the year 1889 and 90. And I did the math on that. That comes out to about $3 million in today's money. And that's, as my wife pointed out, before we calculated for inflation that we've been suffering through recently. This photo, 1895, this is the Hoquiam, Aberdeen, and Cosmopolis Bicycle Club, where they congregated on the steps in October of that year of the Hotel Hoquiam. And what a cool picture to see all their wheels is what they call them, not bikes, but they were called wheels. The building itself was built in, and this is a group of Teamsters in a parade. You can see just kind of in the distance there, the large hotel in the background. This is built in the castellated Queen Anne style, is what you would characterize that architecture. And the structure itself was, as I mentioned, widely photographed and used as a promotional tool in postcards and so forth. All built using locally milled lumber, of course, locally sawn shingles, built with laborers, again, paid for by the Northwest Lumber Company, but then financed by a man named Harry Heermans. And some of you may know that name from the fact that the Heermans family moved out here to establish the Hoquiam Water Company. They did a lot of real estate development, and he wound up, rather, becoming basically the big owner of the Hoquiam Hotel, because the Northern Pacific Railway, as I mentioned in the beginning, didn't build to Hoquiam until 1898. The speculation of Grace Harbor City's prospects and the fact that there was going to be a rail built all the way to Hoquiam was basically slammed down when the NP said we're going to instead go to the south side, and they built the rail to Ocosta. And so Hoquiam did not get rail for another 8 years. This hotel never saw the traffic that they thought it would. And it ultimately, after the 1893 panic of basically this big stock market crash of that year, it all fell apart financially. And Harry Heermans was left holding the banknotes on the thing. And they wound up turning it into kind of a apartment-like living. And he did attempt to reopen it as a hotel at a couple different points in time, but it ultimately was not, excuse that red thing, I guess if I just walk it. It was never realized as the big fancy dream that it was supposed to be. And as you see in this picture here, destroyed by fire, July 22nd, 1910, was the ending of it. I wish we had a photo of the fire, but we don't. I did want to give some context, though, to the location of the hotel. If you note, let's see if we can get that point back. The bridge here, the bridge that you see in the foreground here was the 8th Street Bridge. This is the first 8th Street Bridge. There was 2 over the years. The first was a wooden structure built in 1900. They replaced a ferry that used to cross over from 8th Street, at 8th Street, actually 7th, 8th, and 9th. It moved around different times. And then 8th Street is your kind of main thoroughfare through town, and the Hoquiam Hotel, you can see in perspective to everything else, was just a monstrous structure. And there you see a little better zoom up of how big that hotel was. But as I noted, that is literally exactly where we are seated today, was the site of that hotel. The fire, they never quite determined the cause of that. There was speculation that it was arson. And in fact, there was an individual who had the name of F.A. Schwab, and he was a resident of the hotel on the night of the fire. And he was thought to be intoxicated when he came back to the hotel from time out drinking, I guess. And his wife refused to let him into the apartment. Some people thought that he went into the basement. And the police questioned him. He gave conflicting stories of his actions, but was later released from custody. So his wife, hearing that he was still in custody, she had, right after the fire, moved to Seattle to pursue a divorce, was noted. She came back to support her husband, and neither of them well, when she came back, neither she nor the police could locate Mr. Schwab, and it was assumed that he left Hoquiam to stay in Portland, where he'd also owned property. But by July 27th, now this fire, as you noted on the slide there before, was July 21st was the fire, so 6 days later, the police thought he might have committed suicide. And interestingly, his body was found in early October in the bay near Aberdeen. So it was never determined whether he killed himself, whether he started the fire. The authorities actually pinned it on some sort of faulty wiring comes to mind, but it was determined to have started in the basement, but unclear as to the exact cause of that. That photo that you saw there just previous, I do want to point out a couple of features that you're going to see as this slideshow progresses. You'll note the street in front, entirely paved with wood. Most of the Hoquiam streets in these early days, 1890s into the 1910s, were all built of wood. The sidewalks were all built of wood, and you can see the wear on that from time. Now this photo, you'll note, if I could get that pointer to work, on the far right there, you'll see a streetcar that's coming down those tracks. And that was indicating that this photo was taken after the year 1903, the year that the streetcar system was put in. This is one of two photos we know of to have been taken from the hotel itself. So if you can imagine, on the second or third story, it was a 6-story hotel, so it's, it could have been any of those. Looking to the east, and you see 8th Street on down, and you can see, interestingly, the grid system of M Street, just around the block from us, which would be right up here, where they're laying the street to go north on M Street. You'll note the New York Hotel off to the east, and the whole city block where the City Hall, the fire station, all that is all empty there. Interestingly, that was the site of a baseball field. They played ball there in the 1890s. And this photo is also taken from the top, but apparently it wasn't scanned very high resolution, so it didn't get very big, but that is from the upper stories of the hotel itself. And then finally, this is perhaps the last photo taken that we know of anyway, of the hotel's existence. This photo is of the opening of the new steel bridge, the 8th Street Bridge in 1910. It opened in May of that year, and you can begin to see, if you look at the deciduous trees here, you'll see leaves on the trees, so we know it was taken, as summer was approaching, and the hotel is still standing, which if you recall the notes there, July 21st, the hotel burns. So this must have been one of the final photos of the hotel's existence. I'm going to shift gears here a little bit into the introduction of railroad to Hoquiam and how that got here. This is a fabulous photo to show how non-built up the area around the railroad was. They had to trestle the entire railroad. In fact, there was a whole stretch just of the streetcar between Aberdeen and Hoquiam that was trestled between the two cities. But this is the Northern Pacific tracks. And you'll note in the distance there, the Hotel Hoquiam is right in the center, and just to the left of that is the first depot. That was built in 1898, and it was a project of, again, the Northern Pacific, the Milwaukee Road, and the Oregon-Washington Railroad Navigation Company that built that. And this is after the big effort to get the Northern Pacific to bring rail to the north side. If you are students of local history, some of you may have heard of the ship, the Abercorn, which was a sunken vessel out of the North Beach that had a whole load of rail on it, and it sat in the salt water for 6 years. The citizens of Aberdeen were given the directive by Sam Benn, who said, I'll give 10 days, or I'll give a building lot. He would give a man a building lot for 10 days labor, or he'd pay $2 a day for labor to build that railroad into Aberdeen. They did it. They did it in 1894. The first train arrived in Aberdeen in 1895, and 3 years later, Hoquiam was able to get their extension and build a bridge across the Hoquiam River, opened in October of 1898. And this is what you see is, I wish I could get this to zoom well, but there is a locomotive off in the distance there. It must have been one of the very first trains here to arrive in Hoquiam. good example of the type of locomotives that were servicing our town. And there you see that old depot in the distance. Passenger service, you could go anywhere in the world from here if you got on a train. We were the westernmost terminus in 1898 of the entire transcontinental railroad. Fabulous photo here of the moving of the old depot. So when this is, excuse me, a few years in 1914, when the powers that be at the Northern Pacific decided that we needed a better depot, they didn't want to get rid of the depot that they just built a few years before, so they put it on 2 rail cars, and they moved it just not too many feet, I don't know, probably 100, 200 feet, to the east from the current location of where the depot is today, just down, and then they converted this to a freight depot. Just a few shots showing activity around the depot. Switch engines. This was the water tower that was just on the outskirts of the depot location that would have filled up those steam locomotives. And when the new depot was built, this again was in 1914, they had this waiting platform that was built there. There's some speculation that because Hoquiam's marshy ground was as marshy as it is, that the standard plans that Northern Pacific had for depot waiting platforms were not working in Hoquiam. This did not last long, and myself and some others seem to think that the ground conditions were such that they built it according to their standard plans, which much of their architecture was done by standard plan for Midwestern and Eastern points. It didn't survive. Sorry about the small size of the photo again, but you'll note there are logs laying in the middle of the tracks here. And I just wanted to put this one in as an example to show what the rail here was used for. It wasn't strictly for movement of passengers and freight, but a lot of logs came right through Hoquiam from points to the west, from Oak Cliffs on down. Loggers would load up trains and they'd get hooked up to a Loki and bring them in. They had a dump that was down where the Northwest Lumber Company is at the end of 8th Street, where they'd spill logs off into the Hoquiam. World War I comes along, and you see an awful lot of troop shipments that were coming through Hoquiam. These guys were part of that crew. And then you had large group send-offs like this. And this would have also been, we believe, for World War I. You'll note the depot. If you were to walk outside after today's program, you'll see a nice park setting, you'll see the depot, but notice the fencing around that and all the, here comes my pointer again, all this growth here. I want to point this out in a few slides down the road, what changed here. This is Judge Charles Hodgson and his wife, who were photographed outside the depot. Some of Hoquiam's more prominent citizens today. I threw this one in. This is from the late 20s. This is when the pulp mill was built on the other side of the river. But I did this just to give an example of how busy the railroad yards were in those days. You can see them just packed in there. The different boxcars, all the goods that came and went from our community were brought here by rail. Semi-trucks that we get today bringing us stuff, we're a distant thought. This is the newer steel bridge that you see here. The earlier one that was from those Hoquiam Hotel days would have been built of wood, but in 1909 they replaced it with the bridge that is still in service today. It's the same bridge from 1909. Here's that depot. I'm going to point to Bob here in the front because this cart that you see, I don't know if I can get my pointer to come up, right here, we actually have the framework for one of these carts. Bob built the wheels for that for us, which we have yet to put together entirely at the museum. But nevertheless, this is our guidance photo for, hopefully one day we'll have that all together. If somebody's a woodworker and wants to volunteer, we can take it. In the 30s, you had the rail yard as kind of a site. You've heard of these kids that would ride the rails around the country. They'd hop a train and they'd head off and seek new adventures, and sometimes were kind of, well, they weren't exactly hobos, but there was a whole movement of youth that would ride train cars around the country. And here in Hoquiam, these kids were photographed doing exactly that. So again, excuse the small photo here, but there's Sarah Lutheran Church in the background. And what you'll note in the very center is a Fordson tractor tilling up the front lawn of the Hoquiam train depot to prepare for putting in a victory garden. And this is in World War II, that the employees of the depot were tasked with creating a garden space that was for community use. As you know, during the V for Victory efforts of World War II, there was a big push to put in lots of garden space to aid with food production. They had a heck of a good crop that year. Dave Seymour, I saw you here somewhere. Aren't you envious of the corn here? Yes. Potatoes, all sorts of good stuff going here. And those look like some form of squash. You'll note the building in the background. That's where the current fire station is, and that is a bus barn for transit buses. Here's a great shot showing all the garden put in place. And I live in this neighborhood, and I can only imagine that this would not last today because the deer population here is such that it would devour it. Both of these shots show the freight depot. You can see the old Union Station off in the distance there in its new location. And there as well, you see the bus barn off to the left. Note the smokestack in the backdrop there. That would have been the pulp mill, or it's either the pulp mill or the Northwestern Lumber Company. There was a lot of smoke in our community back in those days from all the mills that existed. I don't have the history on this, and I threw this in because I'm curious if anybody's heard about this, but the building directly adjacent to us here, next door to us, was originally the City Transfer Company, and it looks like it suffered a fire sometime during World War II when the Victory Garden was in place. So if you have any knowledge of that, I'd like to hear about it. I threw in a series of photos of the interior of the depot just so you get a feel. If you were a passenger coming and going from that depot, you'd understand what it looked like. The waiting room, ticket window, from the other direction, looking back at the ticket window. On the outside, there you can see, this must have been just after the war. The words Paragon Packing Company are on the building directly next door to us. They turned that into a fish cannery after the war. Here you see a view from the freight depot looking back towards the depot. And here you see a colorful character that worked at the freight depot. And I don't have his name, but I love this picture, and I love his hat, and I love his smile, and I thought y'all should see it. So these would be towards the latter years of the depot's existence as a passenger terminal. And the very last train that left from that depot was in February of 1956. These are the last shots of the inside of the freight depot before the wrecking ball hit it, and they tore that down. And these photos were taken on the last day of the last passenger train coming from. Later it was converted into an office for the Burlington Northern's freight service. And we had a small crew of guys that were employed to work out of the depot. And this was just a few shots that were taken during its service and as its abandoned state as well, which in the 80s into the 90s, it was essentially an unused structure. And you can see, if you've been in there to get your driver's license renewed lately, you'll understand that it looks a whole lot better than this now. But you can see how decrepit it was at that time. Ooh, sorry about the tiny nature of this. I didn't realize this would project big, but this is a photo, and I'm going to switch gears here a little bit to the discussion of how people reach the water from here. In 1899, a group of Hoquiam citizens, merchants, otherwise got together, they banded together, they sold subscriptions to build a dock that would be public. They called it the city dock or the city wharf, to bring goods from the Chehalis River Channel back to land. And this photo was taken from the very end of that dock of the Harbor Bell, which was one of the sternwheelers that used to serve the area here, bringing passengers back and forth. And this is taken from the end of the dock, looking straight to the east. So if you look up the Chehalis, the vessel there is the MS Sierra, which some of you may know is still a remnant sunk in the Chehalis River Channel. If you head over the Chehalis River Bridge at low tide, you'll actually see the boilers for it still in existence down there. There's a whole story that goes with that I won't get into, but the city dock was sold by subscription. It cost about $3,500 to build, which in today's dollars, pre-inflation, I'm afraid, would be about $120,000 is what it cost them to build that. And I include this photo because if you look at the big mill complex in the background, you'll see a long line. Before that, there's kind of water out there. Oops, here we go. This long line here is that dock. And these structures out here were part of the city dock that was, again, publicly usable. I did want to share a story from that dock, which I found to be somewhat amusing. Some of you may have heard about this event on the centennial moment that I read for the news, or from the newspapers for radio. And I get some great nuggets of information out of the Washingtonian newspaper, which was Hoquiam's daily at the time. And in the newspaper from 1899, this is November 30th, A.H. Kuhn is the hero of the Saturday night accident which recently resulted in the near drowning of a man. Between 11 and 12 o'clock, a man giving his name as Pickett carelessly walked off the end of the 8th Street Long Wharf. His cries were heard at the Hotel Hoquiam. When Kuhn and others ran down, it was discovered that the man was clinging to a pile, having badly chilled and unable to help himself. So, an example of the, I can't tell you how common that was, that a drunk walked off a dock and fell into a roll-on. But nevertheless, a fun little story. And then, of course, you get a story from March of 1900. The Long Wharf at the end of 8th Street, built at an expense of some $3,000, is now in use. Not as one would expect, but as a dumping place for garbage. Isn't it about time to cremate this refuse and not throw it overboard? I mean, isn't that sad that here in 1900, we're still talking about dumping, illegal dumping in places, and there it was, they were the same problem, it's just history repeats itself, and away we go. Here you see a shot taken of that dock, looking straight down the dock. So you see those guys walking there, and then you see the off to the left, in this zone, this would be the public dock. And on the right side, Grace Harbor Lumber Company. This was, when built, purported to be anyway, largest sawmill in the world when it was built, 1903. Now you hear that thrown about a lot. The largest this, the largest that, I don't know. But I know that Hoquiam folks built a very big mill, and it was in operation from 1903 until 1964 or 65. And I wanted to share a few shots of the inside of Lagan's, because if you were attending church here in the 20s, in the 30s, in the 40s, I can only imagine you wouldn't have heard a sermon very well if those planers were running, because that thing was loud. I'm told that you could hear it all through Hoquiam, just howling, the sound of this mill in operation. These are the boilers that fueled that. And they had a cogeneration facility at this mill, as it evolved over the years, that powered a lot of the city. In fact, the Grace Harbor Railway Light Company bought power from the mill to redistribute to the town. Darn big logs that went through that place. Here's a crew that worked there. And then the yard itself, you can see just how massive and extensive that was. All the piles of lumber, early on moved by horse, but this mill was a fairly early adopter of the use of lumber carriers. These are railroad ties, probably waiting shipment to go by steamer to who knows where around the world, but they were a big, big cutter of railroad tie material. And then taken from the water side, you can see the size of vessels that used to call on this port. and specifically that mill. A few aerial shots to just give perspective. I don't know, there you go. So you can see the mill complex. We are in that building right there, Sarah Lutheran Church, Paragon Packing, the depot, and then 8th Street, kind of the focal point here. I've mentioned the Northwest Lumber Company. That was this big mill over here. And these photos would have been taken probably in the 30s or 40s. Looks pretty neat and orderly from up above, doesn't it? Yeah. The city dock was long gone by this time when these aerial photos were taken, but it was, just in that first decade of the century in use. Good shot here, if you're looking at Sarah Lutheran Church up here, post office, the bus depot that we talked about, train station right in here. City had a very large maintenance shop in those days. City Hall's here, and then again, Paragon Packing Company at this location, and then on up 8th Street to give you all perspective of some of these places that we've just been looking at photos of. And then one of the final shots that we have of the Blagan Mill, this was taken from the hill up probably Cleveland Street in that area, or possibly Circle Drive area. In its latter days, this would have been in the 60s before it closed. And then we shift to 8th Street. So again, we had those earlier photos taken from the hotel looking right up the street. And I wanted to just kind of give a little sense of where we are in relation to the rest of the town from where we're located here. This photo taken prior to the installation of railroad tracks, or rather streetcar tracks. You'll note that lots of wood in town, of course, as I mentioned earlier. And I did mention that big empty field where across the way here, the Hoquiam City Hall is located. They had a ball field there, and just south of that, this is one of those ball games in play. First rail tracks put in for the streetcar. And then there you see again the Hoquiam Hotel off in the distance, down 8th Street. Polson Logging Company headquarters were these buildings right on the edge of the water there. Northwest Lumber Company's general store here and their offices, or rather their warehouse for shipment of dry goods to logging camps and anybody else that wanted to buy them. And then you get what I call the maturing of Hoquiam, which is when the folks who lived here had seen that this is a growing place and they needed better infrastructure. Wooden streets weren't going to cut it for very long. It was a very temporary thing, but it was what they had. And in 1907, 1908, there was a massive infrastructure project put in to install new water lines, to upgrade the surfacing, and put in modern sewers. And they built this small narrow gauge railway to bring all that construction material right up and down 8th Street and put that into play. There you can see some of those water lines being placed. And then of course the planking being removed. And what they replaced it with initially was a brick type surfacing. And you can see they kept the street railway there intact. But you can see where the modern surfacing meets old surfacing and the damage and potholes, and you can imagine what a rickety path it must have been to go through town. Here you see that wonderful mixing of types of transportation, all the horse dung that's out here in the street. But you see the streetcar, you see parked horses, and it's a town in transition. I do want to note, because of the poop in the street, if you will, there's a little story I want to share from a news, rather it's more of a trade journal that was published in 1904. And this is from the Street Railway Journal of 1904. They do a profile on Hoquiam's streetcar system. And this just kind of makes me laugh here, but I'm just going to read. An odd factor with which the company has had to contend in operation of its cars is the running of cows in the road. The city ordinances prohibit any but milk cows running on the streets and allow them to be at large only until 9 p.m. No fences have been built along the track in the marshy section, and where they have been put up, it has been difficult to keep them in repair. Although extra care is used in operating the cars at night, several cows have been killed. One night, a steer was discovered asleep in the middle of the track, and it was hit before the car could be brought to a stop, and the result, that the car was ditched, blocking the traffic for about a day. The companies had been seriously considering the advisability of bringing a damage suit against the owners of the steer or against the city for not enforcing the ordinance. So far, the company has paid out nothing in the way of claims for cows which have been killed, as it could not properly be held liable. So, one of the many problems that you encounter running a street railway in a city that has cows. So, this is at the very end of 8th Street, and I just wanted to throw in one from the river just to show, streetcar traffic would have brought people like this together to hop on a steamer, to go for a party out in Westport. This is the crew of or family of the Posey Manufacturing Company. And there you see in the background the 8th Street Bridge, the second 8th Street Bridge, the steel structure. Moving down 8th Street, this was the Arnold Building, which held the Washingtonian offices, which had the presses to put out the daily news. You had the hotel in New York, you had parades going down the street, you had moving trucks like this, that's the Hotel New York in the background there. You had right next door to us the Walker Garage. This, if you go for the post offices next door, and then one building on the other side of that, they sold Studebaker cars there. And the Walker Garage later was converted to other use, but next door to it, Swanson's operated a grocery there in the 1920s. And Swanson's then moved their operations, and the city transfer company moved in to the offices where later the Washingtonian moved in and still is to this day. So you'll note city transfer was in a few locations, and here's their more prominent location, which they needed because of the burgeoning, or just really growth of their business and moving stuff about town. They built the big warehouse next door to us here today. Which, as I noted earlier, later became the Paragon Packing Company. Now we're jumping ahead here into the 50s, but just wanted to show some of the street fair activity that went on. I don't know what parade this was, but it sure had a good crowd, and it reminds me of the fact that we now have Loggers Play Day running right down the street in front of Sarah Lutheran here, and if you need a place to sit, come and park yourself in front of this church for the Play Day parade in September. There's a slightly small shot again, sorry about that, but I wanted to show the final use of the building until today's owner now has it as kind of a storage facility. But Lamb Grace Harbor bought the building that was the Paragon Packing Company more recently, and they opened up the oval strapping operations there to manufacture machines for doing bundling of pulp and paper equipment. Now here you see an upgrade to the rail system, street railway going right down 8th Street, and you can just get a sense of how busy that street was. Liberty Theater was in the center here. This is about a block and a half down. You have the Arcade Theater at the other end. You have the Pastime Pool Hall, the Star Cafe. I mean, the place was just hopping. 8th Street was a really busy place. A lot of fraternal groups met on 8th Street. The International Order of Odd Fellows met there. This was their facility. And this was located where the Hoquiam, it's the, what's it called, the HUD housing, it's the Hoquiam Manor, they call it, on 8th Street, just on the other side of the City Hall. And here you see their group out in front. I've got some great interior shots of that facility. You can get a sense of how big the upper floor was there for these big gatherings where people would meet for conventions and all manner of things. And then I wanted to show you the demise of that building, which was in 1962. The October Columbus Day storm of 62 whisked the whole underside of that building to nothing, and the thing collapsed on itself. Now that storm was not entirely, in fact, the plans were in place before the storm, but this is really the turning point when Hoquiam's 8th Street changed. And this group of people got together in a building that they were soon to demolish, the Royal Cafe down on the end of K Street. The man off in the back guy, this guy here, Roy Baker, was hired to operate the Urban Renewal Committee for the city of Hoquiam. And some of you may have attended the talk I gave at the Hoquiam 7th Street Theater some years back about urban renewal. And there's just quite a story that goes with the whole thing. I wanted to show just a few pictures to give you a taste of them scraping buildings from 8th Street and making plans for things that didn't quite pan out as they thought, but some things did happen, some things didn't, but we certainly lost a lot of really fabulous historic structures. And their office operated out of the former Myrtle Rooms, which was at the very end of 8th Street, which was one of Hoquiam's only brothels. And the Myrtle Rooms had its own whole marketing campaign. It was quite a place. Here you see, I had to throw this one in because you can see the church in the background. There you see the Arnold building in the background. Some of you may have done some auction shopping there under Glenn Clevenger's ownership when it was the Harbor Auction House that he operated. These guys were part of the Urban Renewal Committee that were there, and they're scoping out the next things to tear down, which this sequence of photos gives you a sense at the height of that demolition of what happened on 8th Street, or it looked like, it looks like a war zone, certainly. Loomis Drug was on the corner of 8th and K Street, where Batar's law offices are today. And then this is that entire block along 8th between J and K Streets. And all gone. Hoquiam is the smallest city in the state of Washington to adopt the Urban Renewal Program. There are 5 cities in the state that did that. And for whatever brilliant reason, we decided to do that here. But I didn't want to end on a dour note, so I switched back in time a little bit, and we're going back to World War I, just briefly to show you the Girls Community Service Center, which was also the housing of the Red Cross here in Hoquiam. And this is right across the street where the fire station City Hall was located. And it was built with remarkable volunteer effort of carpenters and skilled people to get together. During World War I, they put this thing up in record time, and they were able, before the war's end, or right about as the war was ending, to, on the inside, operate a whole distribution and manufacturing, if you will, of socks, and bandages, and pajamas, and things that guys needed across the pond fighting the war. And a few shots of the inside of that facility. You see the banks of sewing machines there. Outside marching, doing everything. You can see the depot in the background here, the World War I guys there in action. I throw this in because I brought up in the early part of this talk about Heermans. After the hotel burned on this very site, they turned it into a football field, and it was called Heermans Field, and this is where Hoquiam High School played all their games and did their thing before the addition of the Emerson School field. But these guys were photographed on this site, I should say, right here. And then I wrap up with a little bit about the church, because that's what we're here today to talk about, or at least to think about in terms of saving that steeple and preserving this. This photo was taken in 1928 from the air when this church was in construction. And you can see that being built here. It's in the rod before they really had much of the siding on, and before the steeple was fully finished. So kind of a neat perspective of how this building has been part of this community for that long. And then finally, the finished product, when this building was finished. You'll note that with the new siding being put on now, this metal cladding, we've tried to keep that as close to looking like the old siding as it could have, but keeping the weather out. This element will be added back in its, not as a ventilation system, but as an architectural detail. Unfortunately, we're not able to put these little spire points on the top, but there is a nod to this past that will be part of the new creation. When the neighboring post office was put in, you can see the church there next door and the foundation for the post office being built. Pile driver they brought in to build that, and the bus depot across the way. City Hall, 1929, the year after this building was built. The dedication of the post office, this 1932 when the post office was built. And then jumping way ahead to the 70s when they built the fire station across the street from us. And then when the fire station was completed, somebody must have climbed the bell tower or the hose tower and taken a picture of Saren. And this would have been in the early 70s. And you can see by then they'd already put on the stucco siding that is, again, covered up the ventilation parts here that were part of this church. There's the old office there too next door. And then I just threw in one more of those because it was handy and gave you a taste of that. And then today, or at least a few years ago, the church as it stands today with the new addition. And then shortly after, we had the steeple re-shingled in its final capacity. So hopefully, Tom, I didn't go on too long there, but I have finished my slideshow, and I appreciate your listening to me. I would like to introduce again Tom Hoquiam to swap over our electronic wonderland. Hey, Tom, figure that out.
Change here.
Yeah. Does anybody have any questions while Tom's getting set up as far as pictures you saw or things that you're curious about? I'd be happy to take a stab at that, yeah.
That big mill at the end of the day, was that what is now in Anderson Mill?
Yeah, where Anderson Middleton's yard is today was where the Grace Harbor Lumber Company was. Anderson Middleton actually, I think, had a ownership interest in the Grace Harbor Lumber Company at the end of it. Yeah, shake it, I guess, what I found. The red thing. Yeah, so that was that. And then so that's how they wound up with all that property. Anderson Middleton had their big mill at the end of Broadway Street, downtown Aberdeen, up until about 78. And this was just then another operation that they got into, but they wound up, that mill was pretty antiquated by the time that they had ownership interest in it. Did I see, yeah?
So when we dig down into the ground out here, we were doing a preschool construction, and seashells, some kind of shell is in the ground. Was that from the next door neighbor having a oyster thing?
I don't know. You'd have to do an analysis of those seashells, but as you saw, we were basically in the swampland here, and there could have been any number of crustaceans that were embedded in the mud of this location. But I wouldn't know for sure. Did I see a hand? Yeah.
You mentioned the Abercorn, wasn't that the one that had the rails on?
Yeah, the Abercorn was the British bark that was shipwrecked in 1888 and then had all that load of rails. And they noted that if you rode the train into Aberdeen and through Aberdeen, it had you could just feel it because of the pitting from the salt corrosion on those steel rails, that it wasn't as smooth as the track that you would have gone on prior to that. That's, kind of a fascinating story, really, how a town gets together and says, we need rail, we're going to make this happen, and they did. But it was by fortuitous, the fact that the ship was just out there in the surf that they were able to get those rails. Yeah? Well, the line was completed to Moclips in 1905, and it was in operation out there until the early 80s, but it was not in passenger service after the 50s. They would have stopped passenger service, but it was all freight after that, up into the 80s. Are you ready, Tom? All right. I'll turn away.
Thank you, John. So an interesting story on the urban renewal and what's now Timberland Bank's administrative offices was Timberman's Bank. My dad was involved in that, and he had the job of demolishing the building there. And of course, one of the buildings that had to come down was the brothel. And he got a phone call at home from one of our neighbors who happened to be the wife of the owner of the Washingtonian, Ruth Vantage, and she said that wanted to tell him that some of the women in her Y group had never seen the inside of a brothel, and they wanted to know if he would give them a tour of that before he tore it down. I remember the night he came home and he was laughing so hard he could hardly tell the story. It was priceless. fact, it was there. But thank you, and I hope you know, John Hughes is my good friend, and he helped me with he named John, and this John and that John and we collaborate a lot on a lot of the local history, and I'm delighted to be able to talk here. Sorry that John wasn't able to, because he really has a wealth of history about what went on around here too. What I wanted to talk about today was a story I did in 2016 on Boeing when they celebrated their 100th anniversary. And of course, Boeing started right here, right in this very street. 8th Street was the main street in town, and that's where he spent most of his time for 5 years, from 2003 to 2008. But there's a lot of talk, I see it on Facebook and old pictures, and people have these perception about, well, a lot of questions about what Boeing did and everything else. And I was able to collect a lot of history. A lot of it was personal because, as you'll see, my mother's dad, Jerry McGillicuddy, actually ran all of the timber operations for Boeing. He was the guy. And so we had a lot of connection to that. So what you're going to see today, and the article I put in everybody's pew on the story I wrote, is about what really went on, to the best of my knowledge. I shouldn't say really, but to the best of my knowledge, with Boeing in Hoquiam 100 years ago plus now. So what you'll see is, I think I'm going to have to get over on this side so I have to be able to connect without the device there. So if you go to the Museum of Flight in Seattle, and there's a display, and actually the original the old red barn where he started the aircraft business. Just a minute, I'm being waved at here. Oh, I went too far? Oh, no. Excuse me. Everything changed with all this technology, and as you know, as you get older, it's harder to capture. What made me think when John mentioned Blagan's Mill, here's the way I tell time right now. When I was a kid, I grew up in the west end of Oakland. It was the mill at it was the whistle at Blagan's Mill. That's how we told time in most of Oakland, because it was the loudest whistle. I mean, we knew when school started, we knew when the lunch break was. It was all based on that whistle that went off. And our mom would say, when you hear the whistle, come home, So, come on. As you go into the Red Barn, on the right-hand side, there's a display on how Boeing got started. And if you read this, it talks about when he was a young man in 1903, he was a junior at Yale, and his father had died years before, and he inherited some timberland out west. And his mother decided it was time for him to take title to it. And he was intrigued by what was going on out here, and he decided that he was going to drop out of Yale and come west. Now, he was the first person, a notable business person, to drop out of Yale as a junior and come out and start a major company. The other one was Bill Gates, right? They followed the same track. So anyway, but what was interesting on here, if you look at the at this, where it says right here, Hoquiam, that's where he started, and then he moved to Seattle in small print. So Hoquiam was the place. And this is where it all started. So he, I really apologize for all this. There we go. This thing's supposed to pick this up right away. There we go. Part of that land that he got was some beachfront property out in a place that's now called Ocean Shores. I put this map together, and you'll see that all of that in red, about 1/3, greater than 1/3 of Ocean Shores was owned by Boeing. And he owned it up until the 1940s. It was his duck hunting property, and he really did like hunting and all of the activities around the harbor here. And so that's. That was it. He actually sold it to Ralph Menard in the 40s, who then sold it on to the developers of Ocean Shores. This thing is not going to be cooperating again. There we go. This is a picture from the Museum of Flight of Boeing actually coming into Hoquiam. And if you look that hillside off on the side, if you're familiar with Grace Harbor, that is Breckenridge Bluff behind you. All of this right up in here. And so that is an actual picture of Boeing coming in on a steamer in 1903. One of the passengers that was on that same vessel was a guy named Patrick McMonigal. And it's interesting, he was his son was I.G. McMonigal, who was a dentist in town, and so his grandmother or granddaughter was Mira Lee McMonigal, who we all knew later as Mickey Caldwell. She was the person who started the 7th Street Kids. And Mickey went to St. Mary's with us. We knew her all really well. There's a lot of speculation on where Boeing lived in here. Harold Schmick, he always told me he lived in a house right behind the post office over here, just across the street from here. John and I have looked many times, never been able to figure out where it was. Boeing historians claim that he lived with a friend named J.H. Hewitt. And I found in the Polk Directory where Hewitt lived on 6th Street between L and M, but he didn't own a home. But interesting was that Northwest Mill owned a couple of those homes. I think they platted that whole area. And Hewitt lived in one of them, and so Boeing could have lived there. But one thing that I've been able to pin down is that, according to Bob Preble told me this, that Fritz Foster, who was with F.G. Foster Company, told him that Boeing lived where the library is right now. And it really adds up because that house was built by Merrill, who was the owner of Merrill and Ring Timber. He sold it to Dan McCrimmon, who Dan McCrimmon was Boeing's partner in business. It was actually Boeing and McCrimmon, a logging company. And Bill Boeing was the godfather of Dan McCrimmon. So more than likely he lived in that house. And this is an actual picture of the house as it's set on that property where the library is right now. You can see the plank streets on K Street at the time. All of the streets back then were that's the way it was. the land was sold by McCrimmon to the city to build the new library. And here's the way it looked in 1911. The house had been moved to the back. The house had been moved to the back, and then the library was built. This picture actually hangs in the basement of the library, and that car was owned by my grandfather, J.T. Quigg. That's him driving the car. And he was in a lot of pictures around town. He was one of the guys who was really the car guy in town. He just loved cars. He actually drove the first car to Lake Pinole. That was one of his claims to fame. This house moved several times. It moved from the library to the back of the lot. Then it moved to another site where Central School is presently located, and it's now located down next to Home Grocery. And you'll recognize it. That's the exact same roof, exact same house, and we believe that's where Bowen lived, but only at the time when it was where the library is. I did a little land title search, and as near as I can tell, the only place I could find where he actually owned any residential or commercial lots in Hoquiam was on 8th Street, right in what was now the parking lot of the former Masonic Temple. And this is it. I could never tell if there was any building on it or not, but he did actually own that. And later, I discovered in 1908, he bought that lot in 1907. In 1908, and McCrimmon had an office in Aberdeen, and which kind of made sense because the logging operations were up the Wishkah. They had a splash dam where they brought the logs down the Wishkah, and he was a 40% owner of the Wishkah Boom Company, so all of the logs came down the Wishkah River into Aberdeen. So it made sense that they would have an office there. And here's where that office was located. It would be right where in the parking lot of the Jack in the Box on East Wishkah Street, right next door to the former Star Wars store. Kind of ironic. But he did enjoy life on the harbor. And this was the decennial record of the class of 1904. He would have been a graduate of Yale in 1904 had he stayed there. And his family provided this document to John, and this is something out of it. And here's what he has to say. So after spending a summer abroad, I came to the coast to learn the lumbering and timber businesses. The first 5 years I put in on Grace Harbor in the state of Washington. At first I did not enthuse very much about this country, but now I'm very fond of it and would not consider leaving it. Logging and timber business has at all times been a most interesting one. Primarily, it has the advantage of keeping one out of doors a great deal. And then he left Hoquiam, he said, in 1908 on a boat. And it turns out it could have been this very boat. In 1907, this is an article out of the Grace Harbor Herald. In 1907, he built a boat in Hoquiam called the Widgeon, and it was only 40 horsepower, but it was just a little small pleasure boat. And it could have been the very boat that he took to Seattle when he left Hoquiam to move to Seattle. He also built, I don't know if this boat was built, but a larger one he brought into Hoquiam. This would have been in 1912, and he was here preparing to take a group of people on a trip to Alaska. And it talks about where he had that boat, and going back to when he christened that first boat, when he christened the boat in the Hoquiam River, he had a big party at the New York Hotel, which John mentioned several times, where he had a big ball and a great big party celebrating his first yacht. Now, he had many yachts over the years. This is a picture of a couple of them. This was the Taconite. I'm not sure if that ever came into Grace Harbor, but it was the first Taconite, and all of his boats thereafter were called the Taconite. It was named after a mine that he had inherited, and that was a rare mineral that was used in aircraft and still used in some things today. Very durable metal. But this is the larger one that used to fly around Puget Sound when he was alive, and then when his son, Bill Bowen Jr. had it. I recall seeing it on the Sound a couple of times. I don't know whatever happened to it after that. So Greenwood Logging Company was his operating company here in Grace Harbor. And it was established sometime around when he first arrived in 2003. And operated until 1939 when it was dissolved. And the timber holdings he had were up the east or the west Wishkah River and then bordering the east Hoquiam River. And he initially put all these logs down via a splash dam into the west Wishkah, down the Wishkah River, into the Wishkah Boom Company, which is about a mile or so up the West Wishkah Road. And you'll see the remnants of an old log booming area in there, and that was the Wishkah Boom. He got in a big dispute with his partner because he felt they were charging him too much. It actually ended up in a lawsuit. And it was in, I don't know, around 1918, because I think my grandfather was involved in it. I read some testimony on it where he had to testify. And he didn't prevail in the lawsuit, even though he was a 40% owner. They were charging him more than they were charging the others. But so he decided, well, heck with that, I'm just going to build my own railroad, which he did. And he built the railroad and bypassed the Wishkah River, ran it over into the East Hoquiam River, and it was called the Greenwood Railroad. And if you're familiar with that East Hoquiam Valley, when you go up to the cutoff road to Wishkah, go about a mile up the Yeoman's Road and you'll see the Greenwood Road. That was the railroad grade that came from his logging camp up on the West Wishkah River, came across into the East Hoquiam Valley and followed it down. And then he had a log dump down on the Hoquiam River, and it still exists. I'll show you some pictures in a minute. But this was 1918 is when my grandfather, Jerry McGillicuddy, went to work for him. And my mother tells an interesting story, because Jerry was a county treasurer for a while, and then he became a county commissioner. And about that time, my mother was born in 1915, and so he was beginning to raise a family, and he didn't want to have to try to raise a family on a salary that he would have to get reelected every 2 to 4 years. So he decided to not run again. He actually applied for a job in Seattle, and he was hired by Boeing Aircraft Company, which had started up there in the Red Barn about that time. And he was he'd only been there a short time, and some guy came into his office and said, well, Mr. Boeing would like to see you in his office. And he thought, well, my days are numbered, you know. He figured something messed up. We went into the office, and Boeing knew him because in those days, when you paid your taxes, you had to take the money to the treasurer's office and pay it in person. You couldn't do it any other way. So Boeing would go in there and knew him. And he says, you know, I saw your name on the payroll, and I'd like to make a proposition to you. He says, we're going to start logging my timber holdings more aggressively in Grace Harbor. And I don't have a manager. By that time, McCrimmon had died, and they broke up the partnership before that. Then McCrimmon died. And I need somebody to run it. Would you mind if I moved you back to the harbor? And so he moved me back to Aberdeen at the time, and he worked for Boeing until they dissolved the company, and then worked for him after that during the war. But these are photos of the Greenwood Logging Company. It was a very progressive logging company. If you look at this logging camp, it was like none other on Grace Harbor. All painted white. It wasn't old railroad cars just jammed in together. It was actual buildings and structures. Some of them were very large, very well maintained. It looked more like a spa in the Alps than a logging camp. There's another shot of it. These are shots that were taken by Kinsey, who was one of the notable photographers at the time. They're curated by the University of Washington Library. I've seen them pop up on Facebook. People have taken copies of them. If the UW catches you on that, you may lose your season tickets at the Husky. But this is what the inside of the mess hall, or the cookhouse looked like. Look, and I actually have a cup and saucer that a guy, somehow he got a hold of me. He swears it came out of the Greenwood Logging Company, and I have it at home. But that's the way they ate. Look at that. It was pretty good. My mom remembers going up there on the speeder on the weekends and eating. She said it was an incredible place. This is the cookhouse. Boeing knew if you were going to be successful, you had to take care of your employees, and he really did. My mom always talked about how well he treated her family. So this is the size of the trees. These guys were getting ready to go up and rig a tower on a spar tree. Look at the size of that. You can see the railroad coming in alongside. And these donkeys were huge back then, and they skidded their ways through the woods. And you can see why they had to be, because of the size of the timber that they were bringing out. I've talked to some timber guys, and they said that holding where Boeing had was some of the best growing timberland in North America, if not the world. Just that particular valley, right in the foothills of the Olympic Mountains, and close enough in a kind of a weather zone that you got really just the right climate for the trees. So originally they had to pull the logs. They would pull the logs out to the rail with these donkeys, and then roll them onto the cars. And you can imagine what it was like. That's what these devices here, they would just take the log and roll it up to the car, and then they would take it down to the dump, or wherever. When they had the splash dam, they still had to get it down to the dam, and then the splash dam would carry it down. But the only way they had to move it was either with oxen or by rail. Here's a spar tree. Then they started running a rail in next to the spar tree, and if they could get the logs close enough, then they could load the rail cars that way. And then Boeing, I said he was ahead of his time. This is one of the first pictures I've ever seen of a heel boom, and this is where a crane on a car that would pick up those logs and actually load it onto the car. And this is the heel boom, which works like this, and it's the same principle. Look today, if you go down to the mill, Dahlstrom's or any place else, they still use that principle, but now it's all hydraulic. They pick it up, put one end of the log against the boom or the heel, and then they can lift it up and then bring it over, boom down, and set it wherever they want. But this was, these pictures were taken sometime in the 20s, and that was way ahead of its time. It's the same principle. And then down on about 3 miles up the East Hoquiam Road is where the dump was. And this was the actual picture. The logging locomotive came down, or the railroad came down, and they would dump it into the river. And that boom still exists today. If you go up there and there's a little boat launch, you'll see it on the left-hand side as you're going up about 3 miles up, and it's a good fishing spot. Well, the log dump is right here. There's the piling right there. And you'll recognize this sign, and there it is, the same old piling in there. And that's where the railroad ended. They would go in the water, and then the tug rafted up and brought down to Hoquiam through the Hoquiam River. Now, during World War II, Boeing had a lot of branch plants. There were 9 different communities, and there's a lot of talk about what they did in different places around Grace Harbor. John has done a lot of research on that, and you'll see some of the photos here. But what was interesting was the Aberdeen and Hoquiam combined had a total of 3 branch plants. All of the other communities had 1. And here's the reason why, I believe. There was a guy that was the assistant to the manager of branch plants for Boeing, Jerry McGillicuddy Jr., who you saw earlier, who was my grandfather. And so we got 3, everybody else got 1. But anyway, he was very involved in the company. This is back when they were starting to build commercial airplanes, and this is him right here in a marketing photograph for one of their commercial aircraft that they were planning to build. One of the most talked about plants was what they call the Boeing plant in Aberdeen, or the Goldberg building, which is down kind of where the on and off ramps for the Chalice River Bridge come together at the foot of G Street. This is a big gathering out in front of the plant, and it was commemorating the day when they raised the T, I think it's called the T flag, wasn't it, for?
This is the Navy, Army Navy E Award for excellence, wasn't it?
It was the excellent, but when we sold bonds.
Bonds, yeah.
If the employees bought enough bonds through their employment deduction plan, and if they reached 90%, they could raise the flag over their building, and that's what this was all about. And they were raising the flag down at the foot of G Street, going back. If that building's still there, it looks exactly like that today. It was actually owned by the Goldberg family, and they leased it to Boeing. I got a copy of the lease from the Grace Harbor Title Company. But it was interesting that when in that particular building, they built the chin turrets for the B-17. And those were it was B-17G, and it was a later version because they discovered that the Germans were coming up underneath the plane, and it was a weak spot, and they could shoot them out of the sky by coming up. Well, they put that chin turret in when there was a guy who would be out in, I think he was out in this area here, and his job was to shoot down at them as they were coming up. Kind of a precarious position to be in. But this was actually taken in Hoquiam. One of them was in Hoquiam I don't know how many years ago. I actually went up and flew in that plane. It was kind of fun to go. This was I took back in Omaha at the Strategic Air Command Museum. Very same thing, the chin turret that was probably made in Aberdeen. The Goldberg family, there was a program during the war. If a person bought enough war bonds, they could name a B-17 or a B-29. Well, Goldbergs, they were at least famous from the government, so I guess they bought bonds, and they named one of the planes the Goldberg Easy Pay. And the Easy Pay was the name of their credit plan for the Goldberg furniture here in Aberdeen. It was kind of funny, and I got this picture from Larry Goldberg, and if you want to see it, you can see it today. If you go drive down East Heron Street in Aberdeen, and painted on the side of the wall, Doug Orr put this up, and it's all those photographs, and the one in the upper right-hand corner is the Goldberg Easy Pay. And that happens to be a Goldberg building that he painted it. But it was really, and then in Hoquiam we had two plants, and they built B-29 parts. And the one is just down the street here. We used to be a YMCA. It's kitty corner from the Elks Club. And if you're old enough like me, you remember the Sober Trailer, and then it became a YMCA, and then a church, and now Ben Winkleman owns it as an event center. And it was built as the central market, and it was a grocery store, kind of like a wholesale grocery in Hoquiam. And this is a picture of an older one back when it was first built. The other location was where the transit station is currently owned, operated, and that was just a garage. And when I was a young man, it was actually a commercial parking garage and a mechanic, and it was the home of Lawrence and Macon Fuel Company. And some of you here probably remember Mrs. Lawrence, and Pat K. Lawrence still owns the house that they lived in up on Gale Street. Anyway, they both made those parts, and this is a view. This is a Jones photo, and they made the tail gun sections for B-29s. And this is inside that factory. Those windows, those glass block windows, I think are still in that building. And so this is clearly in that building that still exists across from the library. And this is the uniform they wore. I just zoomed in on this lady. You could see it says Super Fortress, which was the name of the B-17. That's what they called them. And there was a lady I don't know where this picture was taken, but it ended up in John Larson's archives at the Polson Museum.
That's Beth Miller's mom.
Where?
Am I right, Beth? Yeah. Sorry to call you out, but I just think that's.
Can you raise your hand so we can all see who you are? That's her mother in that picture. And she worked in that plant. And she could actually still wear those coveralls when that picture was taken. Well, thank you very much for providing that. So this is what the Boeing, the B-29 looked like when it was flying over the bad guys and all those bombs were dropping down. But that gun turret on the end was what was built in Hoquiam, or that it was the tailpiece was built in Hoquiam. But I want to explain that a little bit later because, and this once again would just protect that from planes coming up underneath and attacking the plane. So this was another one back in Omaha in that museum there. There's also the B-29. You can see the gun turret there. But John Larson actually has a tail section of that plane. I don't know how you got it, but it's hanging in the warehouse over on Riverside Street.
Museum of Flight had it. They were storing one and they gave us a spare.
Pardon?
The Museum of Flight in Seattle gave us a spare that they had.
Okay.
Because they were storing it.
Okay. But this one, if you notice, this one does not have the guns in it. And there's a reason for that. That because these planes were designed to carry heavy bombs, they wanted to lighten them up so they could carry bigger, heavier, more bombs. And so on the actual bomber version of these, they took the gun turret out just to lighten them up a little bit. And I believe that this plane was actually designed to carry the atomic bomb. It was not used in Japan though. That's a different story. But that gun turret was made in Hoquiam in one of those two planes, or that tail section, excuse me. One of the B-29s was flown by a local guy named Bob Bowerman. You might recognize that name. This is a picture of him and his plane. I don't know if how it got named the city of Aberdeen, but it did. He was the lieutenant at the time, but he was the commander of that particular plane, and this is his group, and he was stationed in Guam during World War II. And here's a story that came out of an article in Grace Harbor Talk. It is obviously to Robert C. Bowerman from Aberdeen and his crew had flown 30 missions in their B-29 to city of Aberdeen from their base in Guam. After World War II, Bowerman and two friends opened up Western Washington Airways at Moon Island Airport, which is now Bowerman Field. And Bowerman worked hard to promote the airport. Sadly, his business failed, and Bowerman was killed on a mission in the Korean War. And in his memory, the field was named Bowerman Field. So that's how we have Bowerman Field today, from Bob Bowerman, B-29 pilot. So this is what they looked like in the air. And they would fly in formation and then just drop these massive amount of bombs. And it was interesting when I took that picture of the B-17 and the B-24, they were both in Hoquiam at the time. And I wrote another article, I didn't share it with you, but the B-17 was built by Boeing, the B-24 was built by Consolidated Aircraft. As a coincidence, both of those guys, Bill Boeing was from Hoquiam, Reuben Fleet, who owned Consolidated, was from Montesano. And they accounted for 70% of all of the heavy bombs dropped in Europe during World War II by airplanes built by two Grace Harbor guys. And I tell people, we might be speaking German these days if it wasn't for those two guys. That's what they looked like, and I can remember, and it was sometime after the war. I was born in 1942, and so it had been about 46, 40, somewhere around then. They were bringing these planes back from overseas. And I lived next door to the Sundquist family, and I remember we were told, everybody in town knew that a group of these planes were going to be coming over. I don't know if it was Garmin or who it was, but I can remember being out there, and it just seemed like this endless stream of planes, and they were just like treetop level. It was the most deafening sound I've ever heard. I can still hear it today, but you know, people were out waving. It was, I can't help but get choked up about it. It was really something. But anyway, that's the story about Boeing and Grace Harbor. I got a few more things I want to mention to you, but if you have any questions about Boeing, I'll take a few minutes before I skip on. Okay, time's up. So the next thing I have, since we're talking about the Sarah Lutheran Church, and I know there's a lot of Scandinavian history here, I do a booklet called Culture of Success. I don't do the booklet anymore, but I have a website. I'll talk about that more in a minute. But I tried to pick out Scandinavian families from Grace Harbor that are international acclaim. International. This is Dr. Walter E. Brown. And he was recognized for his, he developed a lot of the chemistry that's used in dental work and in arthritis and osteoporosis and those kind of diseases that have to deal with the bone structure. And he was actually the person who developed the chemistry that went into topical fluoride, which almost all of us have used at one time or another, just brushing our teeth today. But he was the guy who developed that process to do that. Here's a little bit of his bio, and he was nationally renowned, but he also went to high school in Aberdeen, graduated in 1936, attended Grace Harbor College in 38, got his degree from Washington and a doctorate from Harvard. Both of his parents were Finnish immigrants who arrived in Aberdeen in 1915. And this is from one of his cousins who still lives in Aberdeen over in Bench Drive, Harold Bergstrom. One thing I didn't mention that his estate provides a scholarship at Grace Harbor College that still goes on, and there's a garden there called the Three Sisters Garden that he put in. It's right in that admin. If you were in the trustee's office, you'd look out over this garden. Anyway, it's in memory of his three sisters. So the other person is Jace Ogren. Jace, many of you may know, he graduated from Hoquiam in 1997. He's an award-winning composer and conductor. And he writes traditional band and orchestral music. He was awarded a Fulbright scholarship. He studied at the Royal College of Music in Stockholm, Sweden. And he's composed symphonies for orchestras around the world. He has served as guest conductor in many orchestras and symphonies in Europe and North America. And just recently, he was awarded the position of assistant professor of conducting at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And he's going to be conducting the Philharmonia, and I asked his mother, that is the correct spelling, Philharmonia Orchestra, and the Contemporary Directions Ensemble, and the Michigan Youth Symphony. And he's, by the way, at the same time, he's also a finalist for the Monterey, California Symphony and the Lancaster, Pennsylvania Symphony. So he may take those jobs along with that. His grandmother was Norwegian, grandfather Swedish, and this information came from his mother, Lynn Orton. He was graduated from Hoquiam High School in 1997, which I already mentioned that. I don't know how. And this one is Ray Sundquist. I know the Sundquist family went to this very church, and some of you probably remember him. Ray was an outstanding athlete. He was All-American basketball player for the Cougars in 1941. And They actually, he got beat by, they played in the college finals and they got beat by Wisconsin by only a couple of points. But Ray was the most valuable player in that game, and he was awarded the Helms Foundation All-American team for that effort. My dad always kidded him. We were neighbors. We shared it. We were drivers were side by side. My dad always kidded him. All-American during the war, that's no big deal. All the real athletes were over getting shot. And Ray didn't like that very well. But Ray, you know, to his credit, after college, he went to war. Look at the medals he won as a captain in the Army after he left Washington State College. And just after he died in the late 90s, and he was, in 2010, he was named to the Pac-12 Hall of Honor, they call it, and for his basketball prowess. Now, back when he was awarded that, it was called Pac-10, and now they got Pac-12. I updated that name, but if we look it up, it would be Pac-10. His parents were Swedish immigrants and members of the Syrian Lutheran parish here, and this was provided by my sister Jane, who remembers more about our neighborhood than I could ever remember, so I always call her for the details. But Mrs. Sundquist, Elma was her name. She loved to cook. She cooked with a wood stove, and she cooked stuff for us kids after school. It was just unbelievable. I could still taste it. And this is Ann Swanson from the Swanson family. She's a nationally acclaimed amateur golfer. John mentioned where the original Swanson store was just a block away here. And Ann was 10-time Washington State Women's Amateur Golf Champion, winner of the 2005 Senior Amateur Championship of America in Sea Island, Georgia, which is that's a big win. And she's qualified to play in 25 USGA championships, including 3 Women's Opens. And you don't just go there and say, I think I'll play in this. You have to prove your game before you even get asked to play in it. She's currently the golf coach at Grace Harbor College, and she was born and raised in Aberdeen and attended Aberdeen Weatherwax in 1963, and she did attend Grace Harbor College. It was interesting when she was there, golf was a men's sport, and but she was the best golfer in Grace Harbor at the time for her age. And so they actually got the community college foundation to change the rules to allow her to play on a men's team. She was the first collegiate woman player on a men's team in the state of Washington. And her grandfather came to Hoquiam as a Swedish immigrant and started the Swanson stores. So there you have it on Swedish immigrants from Grace Harbor, I'm sure, or Scandinavian. I'm sure many of you know others, and if you have any you want to share with me, just let me know, and I'll do some research on it. So finally, when you came in, if you stopped in the back, some of you, I saw you grabbing them, there was a story there called the Swedish Indian. And if John Hughes was here today, he would tell you about the Swedish Indian. And he wrote this story, you can look it up online, but it's about a guy named Otto Strong. And here's an excerpt out of John's article. He was caught up in the rush of fortune seekers. He was an 18-year-old Swede. His name was Otto Schuster. I guess that's how you spell it. Somebody else will pronounce it. Somebody else probably has a different way, but he left behind the failed crops of his homeland in 1887, and he landed here, and he was changed his name to Strong. He saw a brochure about Hoquiam, and this is a quote he had. A beautiful picture of a large sawmill was part of the bake. That mill did not exist. We got out here, there was no such mill. And lots were being sold from maps and pictures all over the Northwest. But what he did when he got here, he just started exploring, and he moved north up the coast, and he ended up in the Hoh River and liked it there. he married a native of the Hoh tribe, who the Hoh tribe at that time was part of the Quinault Nation. And shortly after that, he was adopted as a member of the Quinault Nation, one of the few whites to ever be adopted as a member. They moved back down to Hola. And if you want to read this story, you can look it up online or grab one of those handouts. You Google the Swedish Indian and then put in the word legacy to take you right to the article. And John Hughes wrote the story, but this is a picture of it. And this is a picture of Otto when he arrived out here as a young man. He looks like an older man, but young men in those days looked much older than they do today. And this is him on the right-hand side. He was 6'4", a big guy. But he's standing in a little bit of a hole here, so he looks like he's about the same height. This picture was actually taken at the hole at the mouth of the Quinault River, and they were on a sea lion hunt. So if you know of any people up in Tahoda or around the Quinault by the last name Strong, they were Swedes. And he's what got it all started. I learned this information too. First, from a guy named Larry Ralston. I know Tony knows Larry out at the tribe. Well, Larry is a great-grandson of Otto Strong. So Larry was sweet.
I'll remind him.
You'll remind him tomorrow. Or Monday, I guess. So anyway, that's all I have for you. I do produce a little website called thecultureofsuccess.com. And in that, you'll see all kinds of different things, Nobel laureates, aircraft pioneers. We talk about two U.S. United States ambassadors, National Medal of Honors recipients. It goes on and on and on. It's an unbelievable way to see in there. Look it up, cultureofsuccess.com. And if you see any names that you think will qualify, the only restriction is it has to be national or international acclaim. Thank you for your time.
I'm Pastor Michelle de Beauchamp. Thank you so much to everyone for coming today. Downstairs, we have a reception. We have some cookies and other sweets. There's coffee, decaf and regular. But since it is a Lutheran Presbyterian church, of course there's a lot of coffee. So, because that's what we drink a lot of here. And there's some water. So please come downstairs and have something to eat. And also, thank you to Tom and to John for coming and talking. And Tom, thank you for filling in last minute like you did. This is amazing. And of course, thank you to Friends of the Aberdeen Museum for co-sponsoring. And they actually brought their whole display from Aberdeen is downstairs for this month's display of churches, history of Aberdeen and Hoquiam. So it's beautiful. So it's all downstairs too to look at. And we have some other historic artifacts, including, I pulled out the records that go back to about when the church started. I think it's 1806 when I looked at some. Wait, when was the church built again? You know this better than me. 1908. Yes, so it's people who are like born before then are in the records. And so we'll have someone there to flip the pages. If you want to look up a name, you can always call me too. Like at the office if you want to know anything. We get those calls randomly for genealogy from people from the East Coast, even in the Midwest. So, but we brought those out so if anyone wants to look at them. And just thank you everyone for coming and supporting Sarin. As you can see, they mentioned the wonderful water and stuff coming in the building, but it's just been a really good campaign that we keep working on to save this historic building. And thank you to the Hoquiam Historic Preservation Committee for walking this path with us and figuring out how we can preserve our history for future generations, because it's so important. Because we have a lot of good history here, as we can see, and we should just be proud of it and share it more, because it's hopeful. We need a lot of hope right now in this world. So thank you everyone for coming. So reception, you can go out the doors here and go down the stairs, or we have the elevator in the back. So thank you.